Professor Thomas writes, when the Civil War started in 1861, there were enslaved people in this area, in Faulkner, Cleburne, and Van Buren County, but there's very little information about them. By 1910, he writes, the percentage of people, of black people in the area, 35% were from Tennessee originally, 25% from South Carolina, 18% originated from Mississippi, 14% from Georgia, and then a smattering of everything else. He writes that the dream of owning land brought most of the black families and individuals to our area. And Thelma, if I might deviate just a moment, I found some years ago when we were doing the Thompson family reunion, this article that was written in the South Carolina newspaper. And the headline is, the South Carolina Exodus, 5,000 Negroes said to have left their homes for Arkansas. Now, immigration of whites is threatened. This is written in December of 1881. There is no disguising the fact that a most alarming condition of things exists in Edgefield County. In consequence of the exodus of Negroes to Arkansas, which began more than a week since and has continued almost without intermission up to the present time. It is estimated that already about 1/5 of the entire Negro population of the county, of more than 5,000 persons, has gone, and the fever is still spreading. There has been nothing like it since the days of Pharaoh. That's exaggeration, isn't it?
Wow.
And the situation may well occasion the deepest anxiety for the future. In the ridge section of the county, extending from the Lexington boundary of this place along the line of Charlotte, Columbia and Augusta Railroad, and east of this road to the Aiken County line, embracing a stretch of territory 24 miles long and 45 miles wide. It is estimated that at least 4/5 of the Negroes have joined this exodus. I'll skip some of it. It says some of the most extensive plantations in this section, on which large number of Negroes were formerly employed, are now without one colored laborer.
All right.
And the outlook is gloomy enough to cause widespread dismay. The reports heretofore published in the newspapers have not exaggerated a single feature of this unparalleled movement. Entire settlements of blacks have been depopulated, and the public roads leading to Augusta, Georgia that is, has resounded day and night for the past week with the shuffling tread of a picture and motley caravan. To add to the complications of the situation, a number of white people talk of leaving the county on account of the passage of the stock law and the lack of labor. And it goes on. I wanted to read that to give you a context of the immigration into this area. And one thing I don't think that Dr. Thomas talks about in here is the fact that one of the reasons why Arkansas was so attractive is because the governor of Arkansas and other politicians were seeking black migration into the state. And the railroads particularly had a lot of land they wanted to divest of, and they were selling land very cheaply and advertising it to blacks. You can buy land here cheaply. And so that draw, and like it was said before, the desire for ownership of your own land, for true emancipation of being your own boss, that led a lot of our forebears to come here. Dr. Thomas says he interviewed a number of people from the area, as has been said. And Treece and I are going to read the words of Mr. Albert Washington. He writes, Albert Washington, the patriarch of the Mountain View community, just north of Clinton, talked about his grandfather who came from South Carolina a few years after the Civil War ended. So he must have been part of that caravan of people leaving South Carolina. He writes these words of Mr. Washington. My mother's father's name was Milby McNeely, and he lived in South Carolina during the Civil War. He must have been about 40 when that war started, and his master had him building what they call breastworks for the soldiers, the Confederates. He was head of some slaves that would go ahead of the army, and they cut trees and build breastworks for the soldiers to get behind to fight. And that's what he'd been doing when the war ended. He's got to support the war to keep him enslaved. Isn't that something? Mm-hmm. And he made up his mind to get away from there and move his family out of South Carolina. He was freed, but he wasn't free. I like that. He was freed, but he wasn't free.
True.
He decided they'd have to slip out by night. I don't remember him telling that his master gave him anything at the start. I don't know how he got his start. But they got away from there, and I heard him say that he laid in a ditch or by the side of logs in daytime, get up and travel at night. That's the way he got far enough that he got in communication with some others that wanted to leave there. And he picked them up, and they picked him up and brought him and helped him out. That bunch had some oxen and a wagon, and somehow or another, he got them a little ox cart that he put some oxen to, and that's the way they traveled, with a two-wheel cart. You see, he had a family that he had to bring with him, his wife and 2 or 3 or 4 of his oldest children. Well, when they started out, they didn't have any friends to help them. Some would go ahead, maybe leave a week or 2 ahead of time, kind of scouts. And they find these friends that was expecting them some way or t'other. Grandpa was one of these scouts, and he'd come back to his family at night, and they'd load up what they could and just pull out and hide out in daytime. They stop in places, friendly places, for a year or 2, but he didn't tell me about what happened to him on his way coming. That's been lost. And finally, they come into this county. That's as far back as I heard them talking. But they came in here, and right side of the town of Clinton, back south, between there and that little Red River, along in that area, they put up little huts. And they stayed on that side of town for a while, maybe a year or 2. About that time, about 1880, we had 2 groups of black people in here. One set they called the Red River community because they stopped over there on that Red River side and they settled. The other community was up on the side of this hill north of Clinton, and they called it Mountain View. And they built a little church in that Red River community, and grandfather was the pastor of that church. And it's us, just mostly his family. He had a pretty good sized family that he brought from South Carolina. And his name was Milby McNeely. He was a McNeely. That was on my mother's side. But they couldn't get the land that they needed, and they traveled from that. We moved on this side of town, the north side of Clinton. He homesteaded a little tract, 160 acres of land. Back down on that side of this hill, from here, back down there, he could look out, he could look over the town. There was another road back then. It was already a black community back then, and his family got land too. And he stayed there. He homesteaded that place and cleaned it up. He improved it, built a home on it. And he raised most of his family, part of his family there. Some of his family was born in South Carolina, and they were married by that time. Grandfather McNeely couldn't read or write. Many of the blacks who settled in, and that's ending the words of him right now. Professor writes, many of the blacks who settled in the northern part of Faulkner County were born in Tennessee and Mississippi. Mrs. Early Viola Kemp Kane of the Solomon Grove community spoke of early settlers there. You can go ahead and pick up.
There were very few musical instruments in the area among the blacks in 1910. But in the Mountain View community on Saturday nights, there was often a minstrel show for the entertainment. Albert Washington told about them. Back when I was a teenager, and before we had dances, we had guitar pickers, and we had a little band. The young folks did, you know. We never did have a fiddle player. We didn't have nothing but a guitar picker and harmonica player. And we had one little boy that could play a Jew's harp pretty good. We didn't have any drums. And we produced a little minstrel show. We'd play for the people, have a little show. We entertained people at times. And it was something like the black-faced minstrels of the white folks. I was one of the men that would crack the jokes, me and one of my cousins. We'd crack jokes for the whole crowd. We'd stay up till 12 o'clock at night, quit at midnight on Saturday nights. The pioneer leaders in the black communities, including those who could not read and write, understood the importance of education for the children. The school often was held in the church house. The 4 months term was divided. The first half came during the months of July and August, when there was little farm work to be done. School stopped for black and white children while they picked the cotton and harvested the other crops. Then the classes resumed, approximately through October and November. Some of the black schools were for longer terms than for schools of whites. The early black communities were well remembered by their senior citizens for their neighborliness. There were some tasks with which one man needed help, especially in building houses and barns, and in piling and burning logs on land to be cultivated. Barn raising, house raising, and log rolling was commonplace in the season of the year when farm work was at a standstill. The host and hostess always provided food at noon for all workers, with the help of women from neighboring families. Albert Washington told of other situations when neighbors helped. Grandfather would cut some timber down, cut it up in length with an axe, and he would tell the neighbors that he was going to have a rail splitting or a fence building and invite them to come and help him. And the whole community would come in and help him. They'd go there and work that whole day. And if somebody got behind in his work, and his crop rained or something, and he couldn't get in his field, or a sickness, they would all go there and clean out his crop and him not be there. They'd just go there and work his crop out until he got able if he was sick. All the residents of the black communities of our area were farmers. Most of them had only oxen to pull their plows, wagons, and carts until about 1900, when mules were introduced. They raised the same crops as their white neighbors: cotton, oats, wheat, and a variety of food crops. They picked their cotton and hauled it to the nearest gin. For those in the Solomon Grove community, it might be a gin in Bono, Republican, Martinville, or Damascus. George Walker, a pioneer leader in Solomon Grove, hired 4 or 5 of his neighbors each year to come at the same time and cradle his oats. And for many years, he made molasses from the sorghum cane that his neighbors raised and hauled to the molasses mill. His toll was 1/4 of what he made for others. The price of a gallon of good molasses in 1910 was about 30 or 35 cents.
Wow.
And as Ben Kane
Not
explained,
anymore.
his grandfather Walker always had money to spend. There may have been only one blacksmith in all the black communities. He was Joe Dillard of Solomon Grove, who shod horses and mules and sharpened plows and repaired other tools in his shop. Folk medicine was widely used in the early days. Most of it came from plants of the area. Camel's root, ragweed, boneset, and peach tree leaves were mentioned. Peach tree leaves were made into a tea and used on a patient for high fever and sometimes for someone with whooping cough. In pioneer days, Mrs. Viola Lewis Morgan mentioned another folk medicine. And when we had the whooping cough, you wouldn't believe this, we used sheep shingles. And they boiled it and made tea out of it and drank that for whooping cough. Or the measles one. It was supposed to make the measles break out. And I've drank toad frog soup. You take a toad frog and you make a soup out of it. But I think that was for whooping cough. In pioneer days, most of the homes were built close to springs that flowed from the mountains. In the Mountain View community, each farm had its own spring, but some families had to carry water to the house for a distance of up to 200 yards. The women carried the family's clothes to the spring where they were washed. Each black community with enough players fielded its own baseball team in Van Buren, Faulkner, and Conway counties. Games were played all summer on Saturday afternoons, and some were played on other weekday afternoons in July and August. There was no baseball played on Sundays, not even any practice. At the start of baseball team play in the 1890s, there was no racial mixing of competition. But by about the end of World War I, perhaps in the early 1920s, black teams played with white teams in adjacent communities. Ray Washington, the shortstop on the Mountain View team, told of playing white teams in these towns: Greenbrier, Damascus, Shirley, Dinner, and as far away as St. Joe after the team had a truck to travel in. And of course, they played black teams as far away as travel facilities would permit. Some players on the team walked or rode mules to out-of-town games in early days. Most of the boys in the area had traps made of boxes or hollow logs, which they baited with corn or sweet potato trying to catch rabbits. A few men and boys kept flat traps of boards, such as were used to cover houses, and caught quails. One black man in nearby Conway County was a great fox hunter in early days. He kept fast dogs, and his grandsons may be still hunting with the same strain of dogs. Roy Hawkins talked about him. There was an old man that lived up there on Number 9 Highway in Conway County, and he was a fox hunter. He kept them hounds all the year round. He was a black man, and he fox hunted too.
Great stuff. Wow.
For the-
Thank you so much.
For the younger people who don't know, before Cousin El Bessie led the effort to incorporate Twin Groves, this was called Solomon Grove. So when you heard it read in here about Solomon Grove, this is Solomon Grove. There used to be Zion Grove up there by the highway and Solomon Grove. And El Bessie led the effort, twisted a few arms, and got us incorporated. So there was a Zion Grove, Solomon Grove, now it's Twin Groves.
That's right.
Cool. Thank you guys so much for those excerpts from Mr. Edwards' book.